I hate theater. Well, it's so complicated, isn't it? It used to be, sitting in a darkened theater, that all you needed to worry about was whether the show would be good or not. Would the songs be catchy and help forward the story? Would the actors give performances that swept you up in the romance of it all? Would you, by the end of the evening, want to see the small business saved, or the family return home, or the lovers finally brought together? There are always some lovers, selfishly refusing to confess their love until the 11th hour. Of course, now I sit in a theater and an entirely different set of questions run through my head. Will the women in this story have more agency in the plot than a sexy lamp? Will the casting director have made an effort not to consign the actors of color to merely subservient roles? How have story details that were originally unconcerning been reframed by time and changing sensitivities? Where will this production land within the discourse of 21st century theater? Because whether or not it chooses to engage with the discourse, it's going to. All these questions, and lying deep underneath them, is one that I attempt to hold on to still ask myself after all the hot takes have been taken. Am I having a good time? Did I enjoy the show? And why did I enjoy it? Because at the end of the day, I just want to be entertained. I mean, isn't that the point? Oh, how things have changed. You know, sometimes a musical's greatness isn't evident in its original production. The musical Chicago didn't entice audiences in the 1970s, but was given a new life by audiences of the 1990s. Merrily We Roll Along debuted as a Broadway flop, only to be later reevaluated as one of Sondheim's more complex works. And, as I've mentioned before, The Pirates of Penzance was considered a dusty museum piece by 1980, until the public theater revival of the show transformed it into a bawdy, energetic musical. Even when a musical is considered a success in its day, it can take time for critical consensus to declare it a great work of art. Once on This Island, The Light in the Piazza, and even Disney's Beauty and the Beast have transitioned from being defended by a small community of true believers to having their praises sung by even the most critically minded theater artists. I don't mean to compare those three musicals against each other, to be clear, just that each one has undergone its own period of reevaluation and, eventually, canonization. And I think we can say, in the year of our Lord 2022, that the musical The Drowsy Chaperone has been pretty thoroughly canonized.
I don't want to show off no more.
Ever since the licensing rights were released, Drowsy has been produced by companies of all sizes, from high schools to dinner theaters to community theaters to major regional houses. It had a Tony-winning Broadway production, 2 national tours across North America, and has been produced on 5 continents. And across all of that, Drowsy has been advertised with a very memorable tagline, one that comes included when licensing organizations pay for the logo pack: a musical within a comedy. But, not to show my hand too early, I feel that this tagline is incorrect. For certain, it's an accurate summation of how most audiences experience the show. A madcap 1920s-style musical viewed through the lens of the show's endearingly agoraphobic narrator named simply Man in Chair.
We had always planned to create a musical that involved music and comedy from another era, and we'd always talked about how to actually present it. So we took The Drowsy Chaperone, built the frame around it and within it, really, the Man in Chair conceit of a man who's just sharing with the audience his favorite musical from the 1920s, and it comes to life around him.
But the journey that Man in Chair undergoes over the course of this musical is not just a framing device tacked on for context and humor. The Drowsy Chaperone is one of the most understatedly nuanced treatises on the role of nostalgia within the performing arts, and one of the best books of a Broadway musical written since the turn of the century. And if you have a hard time believing that, please, indulge me. Would you let me play the record for you? I was hoping you would say yes. The Drowsy Chaperone is a 1928 musical with music by Julie Gable and lyrics by Sidney Stein. It tells the story of Janet Van de Graaff, the former star of Feldzig's Follies, who is giving up the stage to marry her one true love, the dashing Robert Martin. On the day of the wedding, various comic antics ensue that threaten to call off the ceremony, featuring such characters as a harried producer, a flaky Corinne, a Latin Lothario, twin gangsters posing as pastry chefs, and of course, the titular inebriated escort. The musical ends with not one but 4 couples being married by a passing aviatrix before all of the newlyweds fly off to Rio. Or, The Drowsy Chaperone is a 2006 musical with a book by Bob Martin and Don McKellar, and music and lyrics by Lisa Lambert and Greg Morrison. It tells the story of Man in Chair, a reclusive Broadway fan who, encountering an audience in his small apartment, puts on an old record and guides the audience through the cast recording of his favorite Gable and Stein musical. As the record plays out, the audience learns more about who Man in Chair is, get tantalizing glimpses into his tragic past, and slowly begin to realize why he is spending the day holed up in his apartment, self-medicating with brandy and tap numbers. The musical ends with Man in Chair reaffirming his love for the record before an emotional conclusion alongside its characters. Or, The Drowsy Chaperone is a 2006 musical by Martin, McKellar, Lambert, and Morrison, in which a fan of classic Broadway musicals decides to relax by listening to the album that saved him as a child, before being suddenly confronted by an audience and being forced to justify every offense he has forgiven the musical for in private. As the evening drags on, Man in Chair finds the script's objectionable content to be harder and harder to endorse, and his own attempts at justifying his love for it sounding more like defenses of himself. By the end, he is forced to admit the musical's faults, and recognize that his love for this musical has little to do with its content, and everything to do with a crushing accumulation of nostalgia. The Drowsy Chaperone is all of these things, but before it was any of them, it was the biggest hit at the Toronto Fringe Festival. Okay, let's back up. The story begins with the real-life wedding of Janet Vandergraaf and Bob Martin, both performers in Toronto's improv scene.
Our little community of people, we used to create sort of fake musicals.
That's just as a hobby?
Well, we were all performers.
As part of their stag party, the Canadian equivalent of a bachelor party, Martin's best man, Lisa Lambert, herself an accomplished improviser and performer, enlisted Greg Morrison and Don McKellar to pen a 40-minute script that parodied the musicals of the 1920s through 40s. That script was given the intentionally forgettable title of The Drowsy Chaperone, with the title character played by Lambert. That was in 1998. By the following year, Martin had joined the team to rewrite the production for the Toronto Fringe Festival. Wanting to give the audience some way of contextualizing what they were about to watch, the team created the character of Man in Chair, a host played by Martin who would point out the tropes alongside the audience. The musical blew the roof off the festival, becoming an enormous hit, which led producer David Mirvish to program the show for a remount later that year at the Theatre Pas Muraille in Toronto. A second remount at Toronto's Winter Garden Theatre in 2001 caught the eye of two New York producers, Roy Miller and Paul Mack, who quickly optioned the rights for the show's American premiere. At the 2004 National Alliance for Musical Theatre, the team presented 45 minutes of the show for potential backers, with an absolutely knockout cast that included Christine Ebersole as the chaperone. Ebersole didn't stay with the show afterwards, but the presentation got producer Kevin McCullum on board.
I didn't find it to be a parody at all. I found it to be a window into every human being in terms of what defines themselves. And I think that's the power of this show, is that it's about definition of self and how art and life have to cohabitate to inspire you to keep going.
Shortly after, choreographer Casey Nicola, who had just opened Spamalot, was brought on board to make his debut as director choreographer, alongside music director Phil Reno, also making his debut. After an out-of-town tryout in Los Angeles in 2005, The Drowsy Chaperone finally reached Broadway on May 1st, 2006. It would go on to run for a year and a half and win 5 Tony Awards, including both book and score.
This show expresses the voice of a group of writers and performers in Toronto, and we want to share this award with them. Not literally, but figuratively.
The first regional production was staged in Canada in 2008, and ever since the release of the performance rights shortly after, it has been recognized as a pillar of the modern musical theater canon. That's a basic history of The Drowsy Chaperone, but as I alluded to before, the writing of the show is a lot more than the musical within a comedy that it claims to be. So, let's talk about Man in Chair. When you read the very few scholarly articles that mention Drowsy, the comparisons that are most often made are to shows like Urinetown or Spamalot, other metatextual, self-referential comedies of the 2000s.
There was definitely a trend at that time to examine what the nature of musical theater was. Urinetown and Drowsy were in the same fringe year. They were in different fringes, but they both came out the same year, and they are similar shows.
But for me, the musical that most closely resembles Drowsy in structure is from much earlier than that. The 1985 Rupert Holmes musical, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Like Drowsy, the script depicts a show within a show, featuring a cast of English music hall actors staging an adaptation of Charles Dickens' unfinished novel. However, from the beginning, it's clear that the framing device of the music hall actors is the story the audience is actually watching. If the audience cares only about the drama between the Dickens characters, Edwin Drood, Rosebud, and John Jasper, then the Act 2 twist, where the music hall actors run out of book to adapt and enlist the audience to vote for a possible ending, creates a disconnect between the scripted setup and the seemingly random payoff. However, if the focus is instead on the drama between the music hall actors, Alice Nutting, Deirdre Peregrine, and Clive Paget, then the voting on different endings isn't asking the audience to choose a climax, the voting itself becomes the climax. The audience isn't just voting for the servant Bazzard because they think he was the murderer, but because his actor, Philip Bax, has so endeared himself to the audience that they want to see him featured in the climax. Regardless of what the stakes are for the show within the show, the framing device is where the real pathos is. Drowsy takes this one step further by adding a third layer of metatext. At the bottom is Gable and Stein's The Drowsy Chaperone, with characters Janet and Robert and Aldolfo. The next layer above that is the 1928 production of The Drowsy Chaperone, with the actors Jane Roberts and Percy Hyman and Roman Bartelli.
The groom was played by the dashing Percy Hyman. He started out as the all-bright toothpaste man. His fabulous smile adorned every tube.
And then above that, the highest level of metatext is Man in Chair, sitting in the modern day speaking directly to the audience. And like Drood, the show only works when we care about the characters in this outermost layer, more than those at lower levels. So what is the arc for Man in Chair?
The whole show is a man sharing this forgotten, dusty relic of another era. Part of the comedy for me is his desperate attempts to entertain the people he's talking to, how they're trapped with him.
From the opening monologue, Man in Chair's dialogue is defensive. He anticipates the audience scorning his love of records.
So I was going through my records this morning. Yes, records.
He has to explain the old syntax in the phrase gay wedding.
The phrase gay wedding has a different meaning now, but back then it just meant fun.
He even recognizes the potential classism of a musical set during the Roaring Twenties.
When the champagne flowed while the caviar chilled and all the world was apart. For the wealthy, anyway.
As the show begins, he relishes the artificiality of the story, summarizing each character by the tropes they represent and claiming that such artificiality is part of why he loves the show.
The groom mustn't see his bride on the day of the wedding. It's bad luck. It's flimsy, I know, but I love it because it's flimsy.
And for the first act, this defensiveness works. Partially this is due to how endearingly his dialogue is written. Man in Chair's adoration for the show is so open, so vulnerable, that audiences get drawn in by his passion, regardless of what that passion actually centers on.
It's not just for lovers of musical theater. It's about a lonely person who's found something that he loves so much, it helps transcend that loneliness. And that could be someone who loves baseball.
The audience is able to suspend whatever hesitancy they would have for sitting through a plot as convoluted as that of The Drowsy Chaperone. We don't watch the scene with Janet and her chaperone for any dramatic purpose. There's none to be found. Instead, Man in Chair encourages us to watch it for the metatext of the actors involved.
Now, this is a really interesting scene. This is the only time in the show that Jane Roberts and Beatrice Stockwell are alone together on stage.
His commentary keeps us paying attention to that middle layer, to the story of the 1928 production of Drowsy, so we don't focus on the subpar content of the bottom layer. This is where I think most analysis of The Drowsy Chaperone tends to stop. Man in Chair is a narrator who guides us through this 1920s cast album, asking us to laugh with him so we don't laugh at him for enjoying this musical. But as the show goes on, the threat that we'll start laughing at Man in Chair begins to fade, and it becomes much more concerning that we'll stop laughing at all and start asking unhelpful questions about the content of that bottom layer. This line from Robert is blown past without comment.
Hey, what are you up to? I'm singing a song and a Negro taught me.
And we only get a brief recognition of the racial stereotype of Aldolfo, the Latin lover.
Dear Van de Graffy Bride, I must make love to you and transport you to the place of ecstasy.
Man in Chair does skip over the spit take scene, but in that case it's more because it's inane, and can be easily explained as covering for a set change. But no explanation is given for how vapidly Janet is characterized in all scenes after her songs show off.
Oh, I know you think it's crazy to give up a successful career to marry a man I hardly know, but somehow, for some reason, when I look into his eyes...
Transplant any of these tropes into a modern musical, or let's be charitable to time and say any musical that also premiered in 2006, and you'd probably find it hard to keep the audience on your side. But because of how Man in Chair frames the narrative, the audience is able to forgive dated elements they would otherwise question. And this holds for the entire first act, whereupon Man in Chair switches to the second record, leaves the room, and then... Man in Chair quickly runs in and explains that this record is from a different show.
Sorry! That song was not from the Drowsy Chaperone.
That his favorite musical doesn't contain a hugely offensive Yellowface number.
Oh, it's a slap in the face to 4,000 years of Chinese history. But it had some wonderful tunes.
But in explaining it, he unintentionally reveals a bit more about himself.
I have a woman who comes in once a month. Can you say that? I have a woman? Anyway, she cleans the things I absolutely refuse to clean. She's very good, but she has an annoying habit of putting my records away, and in the wrong sleeves, even though I say, no touch records, Carmela, no touch records. I spoke to her in complete sentences, she stopped touching my record.
And despite the humor of the following number, Bride's Lament, there's no getting around the crucial difference. Message from a Nightingale can be contextualized in 1928, but No Touch Records, that was definitely in the current day. And perhaps that's when you start to make connections between some other one-off comments that Man in Chair made earlier in the show, communicating a sort of longing for how things used to be, a displeasure with modernity.
Overtures are out of style now, I miss them. They didn't have cell phones in 1928, but I'm sure they had something for the ruining of moments. That's what musicals are all about, right? Romantic fantasy, falling in love at the drop of a hat. Will it all work out in the end? Of course it will, it's not real. It's a musical. Everything always works out in musicals.
And then, at the end of Bride's Lament, the phone goes off and...
Ow! Ow! You see, this is what I mean. This is life. You manage to be happy for 5 seconds and then something starts ringing.
Man in Chair's commentary is going to be markedly different from this point onward, partially because he's been drinking.
Now, I'm going to say something here, and yes, I've been drinking.
But partially out of his own sense that the amity he felt from the audience in Act 1 is beginning to fade. Instead of a defense of the next number, he comes out swinging against it.
To be perfectly frank, on some level, that number pisses me off. And I'll tell you why.
But consider that, unlike the spit take scene, he didn't skip it, and he specifically paused before it began because he didn't want it to be interrupted. Plus, his criticism of it feels a bit more unplanned and more personal.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that love is not always lovely in the end. Often, in the end, there are lawyers.
But this all reaches its absolute climax in the moment that Man in Chair admits he has become obsessed with, the chaperone's final advice to Janet.
My advice to you is... And this is it, listen. While you can... You see, you can't quite make out what she says because someone drops a cane.
In a long monologue, Man in Chair quickly goes off topic, discussing his own marriage and its messy fallout. The events that the audience can pretty quickly put together have left him in the nervous state he was in when we first met him.
You're constantly redefining and reevaluating and revisiting before you finally lose the deposit on the house, and the whole relationship boils down to an animated email on your birthday.
And from the end of that monologue up to the final line of the record, Man in Chair gives no commentary whatsoever, just sits in silence and watches the four couples sing about how great marriage is. In his closing thoughts, he finally admits that The Drowsy Chaperone, one of his most treasured musicals, well, it might not actually be that good.
But I know it's not a perfect show. The spit take scene is lame and the monkey motif is labored.
And it's that moment, that transition from a full-throated defense of the musical to a tepid admittance that his love might be misplaced, that is the true story of The Drowsy Chaperone. Here's a question to pin at the top of this section. Are we supposed to like Man in Chair? Not that we shouldn't, but I want to actually interrogate the question. As the protagonist of this story, what makes him compelling? It's very easy in performance to paint Man in Chair as a regressive shut-in who has this rose-colored view of the past. His encyclopedic knowledge of musical theater history, coupled with his monosyllabic responses to the building superintendent in the show's final scene.
Hi. Hello. The lights are out. Yes. Yeah, we had to turn the power off because we're replacing the breaker panel in the basement. Yes.
Paint a picture of someone more comfortable around books than other people. In the original Broadway production, his apartment was filled with old theater memorabilia, and during the show's overture, he locked multiple locks on his front door. We can point to everything I talked about in the earlier synopsis as evidence that he would rather spend time indulging in these remnants of the past rather than facing the future. But none of that would make Man in Chair as compelling if it weren't for one important distinction: his own self-criticism. It's not a stretch to say that Man in Chair has listened to this album before. Indeed, the entire show is predicated on him knowing it by heart. But in all the times he's listened to it before, he's always listened to it alone. Meaning, all of these excuses for the content of the record he's been making for himself, he now has to justify for an audience. Which is why the dialogue is so defensive from the outset. Man in Chair is not just defending the content of the record, he's defending himself for having endorsed the content of the record. For having asked the audience to sit and listen with him, only for them to then hear,
I'm singing a song and a Negro taught me.
See, deep down, Man in Chair knows that Gable and Stein's The Drowsy Chaperone is, shall we say, of another time. Which isn't to say unenjoyable, but he's aware that the show is flimsy.
While you're listening to this, try to ignore the lyrics. Yes, I know it'll be difficult, but block them out. They're not the best, but the tune is beautiful.
But rather than that being a deal breaker for him, it's part of why he enjoys it.
It's flimsy, I know, but I love it because it's flimsy.
This balancing act, how we weigh the good elements against the bad ones, is something everyone does for the media we consume. Do the flaws outweigh the strengths? Which errors are forgivable and which stain everything else? And what personal biases sway our opinions? The variance in how individual spectators balance these questions is what results in people having different opinions about the same work of art. And here's where I give an important caveat. One of the most effective tools in allowing the good to outweigh the bad is time. Specifically having grown up with the media in question. Rebecca Ann Rugg, in a 2002 article about the Broadway revival boom of the 1980s and 90s, writes, "Audience surveys have shown that most people who attend Broadway theaters on a regular basis were introduced to theater as children. Wherever the music for these shows was first heard, on a cast album, in a film version, or at the original production, when they are seen on stage, the spectator experiences a personal connection. The events seem to be part of one's own history. This phenomenon, holding on to a work of art for the sentimental feelings it inspires, has a name: nostalgia. Which brings us back to Drowsy. Man in Chair's attachment to the record is only partially based on loving its content. A large portion of his adoration, arguably the majority of it depending on your read of the text, is the sort of nostalgia Rugg describes. The record is a portal, a way of escaping from a life in which he feels he has no control, back to a time when he had, at the very least, a greater illusion of control. Rugg later writes, "The sense of having experienced the story once before, of knowing all the songs already, creates a familiarity and a feeling of personal nostalgia. The combination may provide comfort in a postmodern world, as well as provoke a questioning of that comfort. But this nostalgia, like Man in Chair himself, is a metatext. It's not something that the record itself instills, but a memory that it reactivates within a specific listener. So, when the audience listens for the first time, they don't have that metatextual explanation for why Man in Chair loves this record. Ergo, the only explanation they can assume for this fervent of an adoration must be the content. And it's there, under the newly imposed microscope of the audience's first-time perspective, that suddenly Man in Chair's balancing act of what problems he can forgive gets entirely renegotiated. Thus, the need for all this commentary. Man in Chair knows the audience won't forgive the musical's dated content, but they also lack his own metatextual reason for liking the musical despite the content. So, Man in Chair provides one, refocusing their attention on that middle layer, on the story of the record itself, of this specific production of The Drowsy Chaperone. Suddenly, all of the issues he was putting aside in order to focus on the elements he liked can be hand-waved away, products of another time. I don't enjoy the show's poorly written lyrics on their own, Man in Chair claims. I enjoy how dated they are, how much it doesn't hold up. But this can only go so far. Man in Chair's arc, if I were to summarize it along these terms, is about realizing that this so bad it's good reframing of Drowsy doesn't fully explain why he's so attached to it. Even with the historical justification about the scene change behind it, the spit take scene is still so dull that it needs to be skipped. No amount of context can make the lyrics in Bride's Lament not ridiculous, so the audience is advised to ignore them. And when it comes to the chaperone's final piece of advice,
While you can.
there's simply nothing in the album to explain why Manincher is so obsessed with this line, because his obsession stems entirely from his own nostalgia, his own personal associations and baggage that the line evokes. The story of The Drowsy Chaperone is about Manincher realizing, in real time, while an audience watches, that there is simply no way for the audience to enjoy this record in the same way that he does, not without the enormous layers of nostalgic metatext he personally brings to the album. So, if we take this to be true, what is the turning point? What is the moment when Manincher realizes that the audience will never feel the same way? Well, what makes nostalgia so difficult to discuss in an objective manner is that it is fundamentally a subjective topic. Two people can love and hate the same work of art for the same reasons. When you form an opinion about a work of art, you're not just balancing the good with the bad, you're also making a determination about what the good and bad parts are. But you know what most people, in the current day, generally agree to be a bad element of an artwork?
You know Barr! American lady, no see eye to eye.
Let's put Drowsy to the side for a moment and talk a little more directly about nostalgia. In 2018, a musical adaptation of the film Pretty Woman debuted on Broadway. Its review on the website Vulture, written by critic Sarah Holdren, is, in my opinion, one of the best articles ever written on the divide between nostalgia on film versus the stage. But before I quote it, I need to make a quick clarification about terminology. In my video essay on The Rite of Spring in its 1987 reconstruction, while making a point about the futility of perfectly recapturing any singular theatrical event, I made this distinction. If the goal is to revive a specific performance, there's always going to be something holding the reconstruction back from being comprehensive. This is the crucial difference between the performing arts and the visual arts. The performing arts require a human body for the piece to exist. Since then, I've reconsidered the phrasing of that thought. It isn't really a divide between the performing and visual arts. Obviously, visuals are part of performance. What it really is, and the terminology I'll be using in this video, is a divide between the static and the dynamic arts. Static art would be works that are, in effect, finished. Their form will not continue to change over time, but will remain constant and referenceable as long as the artwork is not lost. Examples of this include paintings, literature, films, audio recordings, architecture, video games, photography, sculpture. While they can certainly be amended, there is a version of the work that can be pointed to, that is the definitive version. Works of dynamic art, however, are constantly in flux and require both someone to perform them and someone to observe them. As such, there is no definitive version to point to, as even the very first performance will deviate from the conceptual, Platonic ideal of the work. This is the realm of theater, dance, opera, concerts, puppetry, pro wrestling, culinary arts, religious ritual, gymnastics. While there are templates that guide the recreation of these works, they do not exist when they are not actively being performed. Now, there are many distinctions between how we engage with static versus dynamic art, but perhaps the trickiest one is the issue of endorsement. Endorsement is the idea that a work of art will contain certain ideals, morals, messages, or worldviews. These can be intended by the author or not, but the point is, as they bring a work of art into the world, the author also brings the messages of that work to audiences. In doing so, the author tacitly endorses those messages. For a static work of art, that endorsement happens once, by the artist, when the work is released into the world. From that point, the work simply exists, whether or not the artist or the audience changes their mind about the relevance of that message. But for a dynamic work of art, that endorsement is done not just by the author, but by all artists restaging it, and must occur every single time the work is performed. If a company produces the ballet Swan Lake, they are endorsing that the contents of that work, both its score and its story, should be performed today. The argument that a work of art was made in a different time works for sculptures or books, but falls flat for dances or plays, because those works of art, regardless of when they were first performed, will always perform in the current day, whenever that is. This is a state that I refer to as the perpetual present of dynamic art. There are ways of reaffirming our endorsement of a static work of art, film screenings, book readings, refusing to take down a statue, and there are ways of engaging with a dynamic work of art without endorsing it. Music theory and score analysis, watching an archival video of a dance, listening to a cast album. But if you are performing a dynamic artwork, that's an endorsement. You can't get around that. And you can either perform that dynamic artwork along the lines of how it was first intended, or you can perform it with a new method that makes it easier to endorse that work. The musical Oklahoma, the opera Aida, or the walking tour of Monticello, these are all works of dynamic art that, in recent years, have begun to be performed very differently in order for the artists performing them to still feel comfortable endorsing the work through their performance. Which, finally, brings us back to Sarah Holdren and her August 16, 2018 review of Pretty Woman the Musical, in which she writes,
"Nostalgia is about objects. Things that, no matter the changes in ourselves or the world, will always remain what they are, what they were to us when we first fell in love with them. But theater isn't an object. It's an event. It brings together huge groups of people and large amounts of money to make something right now. Something that, because it lives in the present, owes a different kind of attention to that moment. Theater can examine nostalgia, poignantly as in Follies or playfully as in The Drowsy Chaperone, but it can't simply manufacture the drug for its viewers without any internal interrogation."
What Holdren is describing here is the inherent difference between presenting nostalgia in a static work versus a dynamic one. Nostalgia requires the things we are nostalgic about to remain the same, to serve as a constant we can return to again and again and again. Our perception of them may change. Time and reflection may give us a newfound appreciation for them, or cause us to ultimately reject them. But if nostalgia is to be maintained as we originally felt it, the art cannot change. And that's why nostalgia doesn't work in the dynamic arts, because the works of art, by definition, change. The film Pretty Woman is a static artwork made in 1990, a time when the prevailing political attitudes regarding its protagonist's journey allowed the average viewer to experience it as a lighthearted romantic comedy. But the world is different now, and as much as the musical attempts to fight against its medium, Pretty Woman the Musical is a dynamic artwork, and must perform in the perpetual present. Even if the story is still set in 1990, the actors, the audience, the musicians, everyone responsible for making this work of art exist, they are in the current day, endorsing a narrative which 28 years of sociopolitical discourse now frames very differently. So what does all this mean for The Drowsy Chaperone? Well, at its center, this is the issue that kicks off Drowsy's plot. A cast recording of a Broadway musical? That's a static art. You can listen to that for years in your hermetically sealed apartment and never have to justify doing so to anyone but yourself. But the musical being performed on that album, which is now coming to life in your apartment in front of an audience, that's a dynamic artwork, and you are now endorsing that album and all of the content within it, even if you recognize, halfway through the record, that you can no longer do that.
I'm singing a song and a Negro taught me.
Because musicals, as dynamic artworks, perform in a perpetual present, the artists producing a musical must find a reason for why this story should continue to be told. This isn't always the enormous task it may sound like. If a musical truly stands the test of time, it's because there's something universal in its narrative that audiences continue to be drawn to, and that artists continue to feel comfortable endorsing through performance. The central conflict of Fiddler on the Roof, for example, about how love of family can necessitate seismic changes in worldview, will always be relevant. Where things get complex is when a musical that contains many elements that artists are happy to endorse also contains elements that they aren't capable of endorsing. The musical Carousel is considered by many critics to have Rodgers and Hammerstein's most lush, impactful score. It also has what many people consider to be a pretty egregiously objectionable line near the end of its second act.
But is it possible, Mother, for someone to hit you hard like that, real loud and hard, and not hurt you at all?
It's possible, dear.
So, how do you go about framing this line so you can support it? One option is directorial interpretation. You can lean into the innate horror of Julie's realization and coach the actor's performance so the line is unambiguously understood, not to be read as aspirational, but instead as a woman's long-postponed admittance that a relationship she felt safe in at the time was actually toxic and violent. Or, alternately, you can cut the line, as director Jack O'Brien did for the 2018 Broadway revival, and as director Nicholas Heitner now wishes he did for the 1994 Broadway revival.
Those words should not have been said on the stage because they are a lie. To put those words in the show's climactic moment is a huge blot on that text. It's outrageous and unforgivable. It should be cut.
But there is always a third option. You can change absolutely nothing and fully endorse the line despite audience members who might disagree with you. But all three methods, reframing, rewriting, and no change, are all in service of the same goal, staging a production of this dynamic artwork that you are able to endorse in the perpetual present. The larger issue, however, is that determining which elements of a work of art are objectionable and in need of being dealt with isn't something that everyone agrees on. Especially when it comes to revivals of plays and musicals, the backlash that often comes when revivals edit the book or lyrics is rooted in the disagreement between artists and audiences about whether or not the material of the original script was objectionable. One side sees an issue that needs correcting, the other sees no issue and thinks revisions corrupt the nature of the work. And this, well, it's a huge topic, and the arguments about whether it's disrespectful to the original authors to make careful, specific edits to their texts is not the issue I'm here to resolve, not in this video. What I'm interested in is cases where that first option of reframing dated material through directing or acting choices is impossible. The 2018 revival of Carousel cut that pair of lines, but left in pretty much everything else relating to Julie and Billy's relationship, relying on the actors to recontextualize it. But for something like Annie Get Your Gun,
Like the Seminole, Navajo, Kickapoo, like those Indians, I'm an Indian too.
overt racism is one of the things that most audiences are just not willing to accept on stage anymore. Not all, but enough to force the hands of producers. So when a revival of a musical with those elements is given the go-ahead, there is almost always some plan in place to edit the show for what is generally referred to as modern sensibilities. The 1999 revival of Annie Get Your Gun was notable for tossing out not just I'm an Indian too, but pretty much the entire book, while adding a framing device where the story was being told from the biased viewpoint of Buffalo Bill. As explained by Peter Stone, who wrote the new book, we were not telling the story of Annie Oakley and Frank Butler, Buffalo Bill was telling it, under his big top. By switching the point of view that way, the show could be naive and even as corny as we wanted, because those big top shows were naive and corny. The King and I, Anything Goes, Showboat, these are all musicals that have had major script edits in their most recent Broadway revivals to correct what current-day audiences would see as stereotypical characters or situations. In more recent years, there are also revivals like Kiss Me Kate, My Fair Lady, and Cinderella that are re-envisioned on the grounds of gender equity, that aim to give their romantic female leads more agency than they had in the original script.
She starts off as this flower girl, but she's an ambitious person. What's very moving to me is that she's the one who goes to Henry Higgins' house for language lessons. She's out of her depth, out of her class, but shows up at this fancy apartment and says, I'm going to take my 2 coins, and that's what I'm going to spend them on. My future.
In Shrew, Petruchio pulls out a whip, and I said, well, that's not going to happen. You know what? Let's give her the whip. I want her to take the whip. We were constantly looking at how to balance it out, and in a sense, that felt fresher.
There are certainly conversations to be had about what the edits were, how extensive the edits were, and whether or not they actually solved the issues, but again, not this video. However, the fact that edits are being made at all is an attempt to reckon with that issue of dynamic art. The musical came out in a different time, but in order for it to exist, it has to perform in our current one, and that requires artists willing to endorse it, which in turn requires a version of the musical they are able to endorse. But this lack of ambiguity when it comes to issues of racism or sexism in musicals, and by lack of ambiguity, I mean the inability for those kinds of sins to be outweighed by the good elements, doesn't always exist when it's presented in a static form, which is to say when the musical is experienced only as a script, or a score, or a soundtrack. Experienced in isolation without having to see live actors embodying the work in front of you, it becomes much easier for the individual viewer to forgive those sorts of errors in a piece. The logic goes, if the only person listening to this cast album is me, and I recognize that I disagree with some of the content, then it's not actively harming anyone if I listen to it and focus exclusively on the elements that I do like. And here's where the really dangerous thing happens. If your primary entrance to learning about a dynamic work of art is through a static representation of it, then the personal forgiveness you grant to a work's objectionable elements makes it more possible for the good to outweigh the bad, much more so than if you'd encountered it in a dynamic format first. And when that happens over a long period of time, especially in childhood, it's possible to no longer recognize how much your endorsement of an artwork relies on forgiving the objectionable elements of it. And how has Man and Chair encountered Gable and Stein's The Drowsy Chaperone before sharing it with a massive audience in the perpetual present? Exclusively in a static form.
Man and Chair is just a guy whose only experience of, or primary, anyway, experience of musicals is through record albums, reading liner notes and listening to albums and imagining the show in his mind.
You have to understand, I love this show so much. My mother gave me the record.
This is why the medium of Drowsy 2006 being a stage musical itself is so brilliant. By having the static cast recording actually performed in the dynamic format it was always meant to be, it confronts Man and Chair with all of the dated elements he's found it easy to forgive in a private listening session, and forces him to justify them for an audience of people who lack the same ability to see it as static art first. Audiences would never accept characters like Kitty or Aldolfo if they were just watching that bottom layer version of Gable and Stein's The Drowsy Chaperone, performed without a framing device. But Man and Chair might, because of how he's forgiven the record before. And the audience, over the course of the evening, begin to slowly understand how Man and Chair was able to put all these tropes to the side in a private listening session, but can't do it in public. Which leads me back to the question I asked several minutes ago. Are we supposed to like Man and Chair? In my opinion, yes, certainly. From the beginning, the opening monologue endears us to him, as his unashamed obsession over this album, and over Broadway shows generally, results in a sort of delightful vulnerability. Yes, the audience says to this acerbic shut-in, "We will follow you through this old musical you love so much. Please tell us why you like it. Please help us to like it as much as you." And then, as the show goes on and Man and Chair realizes this is an impossible task, the audience begins to see more flaws in this person we've come to like. We see his blindness to the objectionable elements of the musical. We see his adherence on the way things used to be. We see him reject an overtly racist musical number, but in the next sentence recount a moment when he scolded a service worker in broken English.
Even though I say, no touch records, Carmela, no touch records.
By the top of the second act, the audience has realized that Man and Chair is, and I'm using this term in its social sense and not its current political sense, deeply and fundamentally conservative. And yet, by this time, we've grown so accustomed to the things that we do like about him that we find it difficult to fully renegotiate our affection towards him. We don't agree with everything he says or does, but we can't entirely ignore the positive elements of him that drew us in to begin with, before we began to realize what we were actually endorsing. To rephrase, the audience spends the second act of The Drowsy Chaperone rebalancing their nostalgia about Man and Chair against the new recognition of who he is. The audience's changing perspective about Man and Chair is presented in direct parallel to Man and Chair's changing perspective about The Drowsy Chaperone. Both Man and Chair and the audience are left, by the end, unable to see their subject in an uncomplicated way, but they are both unable to entirely reject the positive feeling they had upon first encountering it. Both of them, in less than 2 hours, have been pushed through the full arc of what it is to experience nostalgia. At least that's how some audience members experience it. Obviously, I cannot speak to the experience of all audience members, since everyone comes into the theater with their own biases, expectations, prior history, and hang-ups about nostalgia. Someone could determine that the single line of No Touch Records was enough to banish all the goodwill Man and Chair had built up to that point, and walk out. Or an audience member could see Message from a Nightingale as uproariously funny and disagree with Man and Chair's reflexive dismissal of it. And because The Drowsy Chaperone is itself a work of dynamic art, this analysis is largely based on my own personal experience of it, seeing multiple productions of it, reading the script, listening to the score. This is, in a sense, an elaborate depiction of one possible way to stage The Drowsy Chaperone, what I believe is the most dramatically endorsable way of reading the text. But it's still supported by that text. right? Like even if there's never been a production of The Drowsy Chaperone to fully capitalize on this reading of the work, this is still a valid reason to like the musical, right? For the potential of the idea of this interpretation. It's not just an accumulated nostalgia that would allow me to forgive this musical for any error within it, right? Right? Tell me I'm right.
You know, a little self-conscious anxiety resulting in non-specific sadness. A state that I call blue. Let's have a truth. Let's disappear for a while into the decadent world of the 1920s, when the champagne flowed on the caviar chill and all the world was a party. I dug out, what did I find? One of my favorite shows, Gable & Stein's The Drowsy Chaperone. It's a 2-record set remastered from the original recording made in 1928. It's the full show with the original cast included. Beatrice Stockwell as the chaperone. Isn't she elegant? And it's several 15 years before she became Dame Beatrice Stockwell. Can you believe it? Look at some of that. It says, mix-ups, mayhem, and a gay wedding. Of course, the phrase gay wedding is different from me now, but back then it just meant fun.
People don't think about it while watching the show, but performing Man in Chair can be an isolating experience. You're stuck in that level of metafiction for all but the final song, which means being frequently called for rehearsals with only yourself and the director. And even when the rest of the cast is called, doing no scene work with them. During the performance, you're on stage the entire show, which means you never spend time bonding with the cast in the dressing room. Perhaps most pressingly, you have to face the fact that this character work you're doing, all this backstory you're building, all the moments before and objectives and tactics and analysis of every single word in the text, it's all in service of a character who is in a comedy.
Your only copy of Gypsy! Spinning through the air, smashing against the living room wall.
Because a youth theater in Kirkland, Washington is not going to dig into the script to the depth that I did earlier in this video. And neither are you, because you're literally 17 years old. On March 16th, 2012, youth theater company Studio East opened their production of The Drowsy Chaperone, and in the 10 years since that night, I have been in constant reevaluation about it. About my own intentions while performing it, about my relationship to the cast, to the director, to the company, about how getting to perform in a show where I was unable to step out of character for a 2-hour block 3 times a weekend was a bright spot in my stressful, terrible junior year. I can't see the musical in the same uncomplicated way I saw it before that process. I can't think about it without the thought becoming nostalgia. There's one moment in particular that stuck with me forever, that I can still put myself back into as though no time has passed. It was closing night, March 30th, 2012, and I had just finished delivering my final spoken lines of the evening.
When you're feeling blue, you know?
The blocking is to turn to the record player and close the lid, and for a second, just a split second, I think, what if I just don't close it? What if I just live in this moment, stay here in character, hold everyone in that moment with me? I thought about the project for AP Literature I had due the next week, the research into colleges I was neglecting to start, my distinct lack of close friendships, all of which just didn't matter when I was Man in Chair. He used the musical to escape the world, so let me do the same. Let me just stay here, away from everything. And then I closed the lid. Why does Man in Chair need the audience to like The Drowsy Chaperone? On some level, it's a way of being less alone, a way of confirming for himself that someone else can watch the musical and not find it wanting, the way most people would. It's not strange to obsess over a musical that's actually good. It's only an unhealthy obsession if a thing you're obsessing over isn't good at all, but only seems that way because of your own biased perception of it.
What I love about it is that we can present a kind of overblown romanticism in the context of this very frustrated and
lonely and somewhat bleak,
frankly pathetic man in a way.
Right.
Although, the beauty of it is that so many people come up to me and say, I am that person, which is so great.
Why do I need my audience to like The Drowsy Chaperone? On some level, it's a way of being less alone, a way of confirming for myself that this musical has remained one of my favorite pieces for reasons other than sentimental ones. I need to know that Drowsy has a life as a work of dynamic art, and that there remains in the perpetual present a reason to endorse it and to continue to perform it. That I'm not forgiving it for errors that no one else can. See, there's one other funny little quirk about dynamic versus static arts. It's one thing to have nostalgia for a static work of art, like Pretty Woman, and drag it into a dynamic format in defiance of its glaring issues as a way of perpetuating a sort of comforting nostalgia. That's one thing to do. It's a very different thing to have nostalgia for a fundamentally dynamic art form, because as long as time moves forward, it will always be an uphill battle to experience that nostalgia again. To return to that quote from Sarah Holdren,
nostalgia is about objects. Things that, no matter the changes in ourselves or the world, will always remain what they are, what they were to us when we first fell in love with them. But theater isn't an object. It's an event. It brings together huge groups of people and large amounts of money to make something right now. Something that, because it lives in the present, owes a different kind of attention to that moment.
But to counterpoint that doesn't mean we don't have nostalgia for theater anyway. As I mentioned before, dynamic art requires a human element in order to exist. Someone has to dance the dances or bake the dishes. It is incapable of being truly experienced in your apartment by yourself. There are static versions of it, but watching a filmed play or eating a meal at home is a fundamentally different experience than attending the theater or being served in a restaurant. Which means that if there aren't enough artists left who believe in the universality of a work of dynamic art enough to endorse it through performance, that work of art ceases to exist. Look, let me briefly go on a tangent. I promise this is going to be relevant. In June 2020, amid a national reckoning about racial justice, HBO announced their intention to temporarily remove the 1939 film Gone with the Wind from their streaming service HBO Max. The reason given was the film's dated romanticism of the South, frequently cited by neo-Confederates perpetuating the myth of the lost cause, and its abhorrent depiction of African-American characters. While HBO stated that the film would return to the service with a new introduction providing proper context, you can probably predict the inevitable backlash.
If I were to put my moral values on every movie or book I read, I couldn't watch anything or read anything. We have to be somewhat open-minded and watch through a 1950s or 60s lens on what happened 100 years earlier in our country. We don't have to agree with any of it, but to censor it is a huge mistake.
I think it goes without saying that these arguments are reductive and not really worthy of analysis in this context. But I do find this to be an interesting case study in how we engage with static art in the perpetual present. In HBO's statement explaining the decision, there was a recognition that the film's presence on their service amounted to, effectively, an endorsement of it.
These racist depictions were wrong then and are wrong today. And we felt that to keep this title up without an explanation and a denouncement of those depictions would be irresponsible.
By allowing for easier access to the film, they were expressing a worldview. Not the worldview in the film, but a worldview that sees the film as worth watching, whose good elements still outweigh the bad ones enough to warrant a viewing. This is what I think this human LL Bean catalog is talking about when he advises us to watch through a 1950s or 60s lens. Basically, watch it while imagining that the civil rights movement hasn't happened. But really, in removing the film, all they were doing was removing one avenue through which people could view it. And indeed, in the aftermath of the decision, the film rocketed to the top of Amazon and Apple's digital charts. The film, a static work of art, still existed. But even if every streaming service locked the film out, there would still be DVD copies, and barring that, VHS tapes or the original film reels.
I bought the DVD for Gone with the Wind, talked to my daughters about it last night by coincidence. I think it's great for kids.
True censorship, the true equivalent of a modern book burning, would be to chase down all these extant copies of the film to ensure that no one ever saw it again. And in a modern age of digital media consumption, that's simply not practical or possible. Those who are looking for the film will always have other avenues to find it. The bitterest truth separating film and literature from theater and opera is that if a reader wants to read a particular book, even if that book has been banned, even if they've been explicitly told not to read it, even if there's a disclaimer in the front to give context, the reader is able, to a meaningful degree, to choose when, where, and how they engage with the work of art. HBO returned Gone with the Wind to their streaming service with an appended introduction that gave the film proper context. And if a viewer wants to skip directly over that and revel in 4 hours of white supremacist daydreams, they cannot be meaningfully stopped from doing so. But in the dynamic arts, in theater especially, it is actually possible for a time to erase a work of art. If the cultural tide turns enough that a play or musical is determined to be too harmful to a group of people, or too dated in its morals, or even just not well enough written to justify the expenditure of time and money it requires to produce it in the current day, that piece of theater, in its true dynamic format, does actually cease to exist. But even this isn't a true book burning. Artists could still revive it in the future. But it likely won't look the same as it did before. See, when audiences complain about revivals like Daniel Fish's Oklahoma or Lee Silverman's Sweet Charity, which both took works of art with great scores and dated morals and probed the text for new interpretations that are darker but more possible for the artists to endorse, what they're really complaining about is that a dynamic work of art is being staged in a dynamic way, rather than holding to how that audience member first encountered it. Complaints that it's not true to the original, or that it's not what the authors intended, or that it's being updated for the modern day, these reveal more about the people making the complaints than they do about the production itself. It reveals that these audience members always saw these musicals as static, not as dynamic. Again, nostalgia relies on objects that, no matter how the world has changed, will always remain what they were when we first fell in love with them. That said, many of the Broadway revivals of the 1980s and 90s shared this viewpoint of musicals as static, regurgitating shows like Camelot, Peter Pan, Forum, and My Fair Lady, while fully selecting that third option of endorsing the musical exactly as it was before. Analyzing this trend as early as 1980, sociologist Jeffrey C. Goldfarb writes, "The revival musical presents to its audience a pre-existing successful package. The audience comes not so much for a new cultural experience, but for a reliving of a pseudo-experience. These are not new productions of classics involving reinterpretation and innovative approach. Rather, they celebrate manners of the past, purposely without the creative hand and consciousness of the present. As you can expect, things are very different 4 decades later. Nowadays, most Broadway revivals are at least marginally aware of the need to keep these productions dynamic rather than static. Rare is the revival that is a replica of the original production, save for some dance-heavy exceptions like A Chorus Line or Cats. But even then, those pieces still interrogate their texts for elements that simply won't play in the current day, and excise them.
Now the peak, although people may say what they please, is no British dog, but a heathen Chinese.
What this creates, however, is a situation where a theater fan may have to wait literal years for a significant revival of a musical they love, for the mere possibility of seeing it in its dynamic format, and only then realize that they're doing it the wrong way.
Directed by Daniel Fish, this Oklahoma is tuneful and funny, brutal and dark, but still bright. The house lights stay on throughout most of the show. Curly is no longer a sunny hero, but an arrogant force. When the production played Brooklyn's St. Anne's Warehouse, the Times critics loved it. They can't be seen as aging white guys out of touch with theater for hipsters. The Times is so woke these days, I'm dying to drop an Ambien in its martini.
As you watch the survival of Sweet Charity, you keep hoping that, despite early signs of limpness, it won't be drained of all its energy and sentiment by the end. But the director, Lee Silverman, is adept at throwing ash on soap bubbles. The problem is that she's too serious about theater. She wants her shows to count, to have a moral purpose. Sometimes a play is just a play, and not all of her productions can bear the weight of her imperative.
Why doesn't it suffice to make clear, perhaps with a disclaimer in the program, that the Encore's team does not endorse certain attitudes of earlier times, but still thinks that the revived piece is worthy of a revival that hews as closely as possible to the original? Encore should be about actually looking at aspects of the artistic past, including imperfections, regardless of their utility or contemporaneity. And if that mission is jettisoned, I, for one, will regret it.
Now, in most cases, I personally agree with the artists. Works of art are written in a certain time, and to perform them in the current day requires a careful examination of how dated elements can be adjusted without trimming out the heart of the piece, if such a surgery is even possible. But I do empathize with the long-standing Broadway fans, the man in chairs of the world, who obsess over musicals for years only to finally attend that musical in person and be confronted with how many problems with the script they have forgiven while keeping their adoration alive. In fact, I know this from experience because I have a musical that fills that exact niche for me. But it's not Drowsy. See, while my own super heady, metatextual, static versus dynamic interpretation of the Drowsy Chaperone isn't rooted in any performed version of it, I don't see Drowsy Chaperone ever going the route of Thoroughly Modern Millie or Mame, musicals that had their day before most major companies slowly realized that their problems were sort of inherent and they should probably stop producing them. Again, not all, but most major houses.
This time the South will rise again!
I will still defend the statement that Drowsy is one of the stronger book musicals since the year 2000, and that my interpretation, unintended as it was by the creators, is supported by the text. But there's another musical I hear more dissent against with each coming year, which, despite everything, I find myself unable to fully condemn. A musical whose sins, for me personally, will never outweigh its virtues. When I list my favorite musicals, there are 3 pieces that always end up in the top 3 spots, though they switch places almost daily. One of them is The Drowsy Chaperone, one of them is Sunday in the Park with George, and the third one is... Now, before I go any further, I need to state something directly. I do not think that The Music Man is a musical that suffers from a lack of productions. It is one of the most popular musicals of the 1950s, and there are productions of the show every single year in multiple states, often by large-scale regional companies. There's literally a multi-million-dollar Broadway revival still running at the time this video goes up. The Music Man is not a musical you can only experience in its static form. The dynamic form is very much alive. With that said, some thoughts. The Music Man is a 1957 musical with book music and lyrics by Meredith Willson, based on a story by Wilson and Franklin Lacey. It concerns a con man named Harold Hill, a traveling salesman who arrives in the small town of River City, Iowa, intent on selling the town on the idea of a boys' marching band, then departing after collecting the money but before the band actually performs. Along the way, he is pursued by Marion, the local librarian who senses that Harold isn't what he says he is, her younger brother Winthrop, who begins to see Harold as a father figure, and Mayor Shin, hoping to prevent this newcomer from swindling the townsfolk. Over the course of the summer, Harold Hill's deceptions have the unintended effect of helping the town grow to be a less stubborn and more jovial community, and result in Harold falling for Marion and choosing not to follow through on his deception out of love for her and the town. Or, The Music Man is a 1957 musical by Meredith Willson about Marion Peru, the local librarian of a small Iowan town who has been effectively extradited from her community due to her unwillingness to exhibit the same dogmatic mentality as the rest of the town. When a traveling musician arrives to sell the townsfolk a marching band, Marion is initially resistant to what she clearly sees as a con, but slowly begins to see the huckster's actions as inadvertently effective at breaking the town out of their insularity. Against her better instincts, her adoration for the community this visitor has built blossoms into an infatuation for him, as she finally allows herself to be loved wholeheartedly after years of being told by other people that their love for her was conditional. Or, The Music Man is a musical in which Harold Hill comes to a small town, stirs the townsfolk into a frenzy over a non-existent moral panic, stalks the local librarian, who he immediately pegs as the only bangable person in this town, seduces the townsfolk with fictional memories of a simpler past, follows the librarian to her place of work and kisses her without her consent, exploits the immediate trust of the town's children in order to win over the parents and their pocketbooks, only faces consequences of his actions when the librarian suddenly decides that his frequent ignorance of her request to leave her alone have somehow become romance, and even then doesn't face meaningful repercussions because the families of the children are so emotionally distraught by anything their children do that they immediately forgive him for everything. The Music Man is, or rather can be, all of these things. But in practice, it's most commonly the first one. See, The Music Man is an interesting case where there are definitely things about it that are objectionable to modern audiences. But it also contains some things that are on that borderline where some audiences will see it as a problem to be fixed and others won't. Marion's relationship to Harold Hill is supremely understated by the text, and while it's possible to interrogate it scene by scene and develop a reasonable arc for the romance that is supported by Wilson's script, it's equally possible to rely on the illogic of true love to carry the weight. In fact, doing the latter might be justified under authorial intent. Here is a real story about author Meredith Willson.
He had a theory as a teenager that a man and a woman who had never met could develop an instant romantic connection just by making eye contact. And that connection would be strong enough that they would kiss without either one of them saying a word or offering any resistance. Many years later, he got the opportunity to test this theory in a train station in Pittsburgh. He was sitting on a bench in the station when he noticed an attractive woman sitting on a bench across from him. He said they exchanged several glances over a period of about half an hour. When her train pulled up and she got on, Wilson jumped aboard. Without a word, he sat down and kissed her. Got up, got off, and just made it to his train.
And even as I read this story about how the actions of the Music Man's female romantic lead may only make sense when viewed through the prism of a man born in 1902 with, let's say, unique ideas about rape culture and consent, even as I read this, I still love the shit out of the Music Man. I love the personality of the town, I love how it frames music as worthwhile in itself, I love how technically complex the score is, I love the barbershop quartet, I love the commentary about how the structure of the small town normalizes their bigotry, I love Ethel Toffelmeyer, I love the integration of choreography, I love the line,
"You pile up enough tomorrows and you'll find you've collected nothing but a lot of empty yesterdays."
I love a million things about the Music Man, and I love them to such a degree that it is very unlikely that I will ever stop loving them, despite everything that sits on the other side of the scale. I see those elements. I recognize them. And they don't change the way the scale tips for me. As I alluded to before, it is possible to comb through the Music Man's script and find an interpretation of Marion's actions and dialogue that does actually create a character that is three-dimensional and self-sufficient and that centers her arc more than Harold Hill's. I don't think the Music Man's issues are so endemic that they cannot be accounted for in a smartly considered production. But of course, that's the same thing I said about Drowsy before. And like that case, it only really matters if there is a production that capitalizes on that interpretation. And given that Music Man is seen as a safely apolitical classic of the musical theater canon that's mainly performed by community theaters at this point, most productions won't. So the plurality of Music Man productions you're likely to witness won't be putting in the work to create a version that's fully endorsable today. Or, as frequently happens, the artists producing it will fully endorse it as intended, leaving in all that rape culture subtext as an element they don't find to be objectionable to begin with. Which isn't helped, incidentally, by the current Broadway revival, which just exhibits so many other issues beyond the script. From the movie star in the role of Harold Hill, to the almost entirely white leading cast, to the presence of producer Scott Rudin, to the fact that they kicked Beetlejuice out of the Winter Garden, to the too slow tempo of You Got Trouble, to the rewritten lyrics to Shapoopy, to denying critics tickets to any of the previews. God damn it, Music Man Revival! Why are you giving people so many more reasons to hate this show? And why, if there was not a literal plague going on right now, would I still want to fly to New York just to see it? I suppose the thing that really separates Drowsy from Music Man is that Drowsy, like the revised Annie Get Your Gun, has that framing device to give its objectionable elements proper context. So as time goes on, it will be easier to argue for the continual restaging of Drowsy, that it remains endorsable, that its good elements still outweigh its bad ones. Music Man, like the original Annie Get Your Gun, with its absolute earnestness as it rattles through the Wah-Ta-Nee girls and Marion's seduction of Charlie Cowell, has a much steeper uphill climb to remain endorsable, as artists' perspectives evolve to be more sensitive to the issues of its content. Again, we are nowhere near this point yet, but I do fear there will eventually come a time where the average audience member sees the Music Man's sins as outweighing its virtues. Indeed, a lot of people already feel that way, until they see a revival that smartly interrogates the script to give these moments a way of being staged in the perpetual present. As Jesse Green's review for the current Broadway revival concludes, if you're a traveling salesman, you gotta know the territory. If we're going to keep selling classic shows, we have to find meaningful new ways to package them. And you can argue with all of this, say that The Music Man actually contains no objectionable content and that all of it could and should be endorsed in the current day with no edits or necessary adjustments, and you know, I'm not going to argue with you. That's your reading of the work. But as long as people disagree about whether or not it can be staged, regardless of their reasons for disagreeing, we are going to keep having this debate. Because unlike the 1962 film adaptation of The Music Man, which is captured on screen and you can enjoy in the privacy of your own home, any staged production of The Music Man has to be staged in the perpetual present, which requires everyone working on the show, actors and directors and musicians and designers and technicians, to say, yes, The Music Man, a story that needs to be told. I will endorse this. I want to return back to a comment I made at the beginning of this video, where I mentioned that the Drowsy Chaperone's standard tagline, a musical within a comedy, was a statement I felt was incorrect. Why do I disagree with it? Well, on one hand, it's because my personal reading of the script centers on the deep tragedy of Man in Chair slowly realizing that a work of art he loves is potentially deeply harmful, and the action of him finding a way of defending his adoration regardless. But that's only one interpretation, and as I've now revealed, the interpretation of someone who is so intimately attached to this script that my perspective is unavoidably biased. So why else do I hate this tagline? Well, after thinking about it in comparison to The Music Man, I think it has something to do with not wanting public opinion to turn against the Drowsy Chaperone. The fear is, if people only see Drowsy as a comedy, the way it's been frequently staged, particularly by high schools and community groups, then moments like Message from a Nightingale and
I'm singing a song and a Negro taught me
could be misunderstood by audiences as offensive content that serves no other purpose than humor. And the argument, but it's funny, is probably the worst possible argument for keeping dated offensive material on the stage. No joke is so funny as to be worth putting an actor in the current day through the pain of performing a stereotype. But Drowsy isn't just performing stereotypes, it's performing the witnessing of stereotypes. It takes the internal discovery of your fave is problematic and presents it in a way that is dynamic and impossible to ignore. Unless your production of Drowsy is just treating Man in Chair like a funny narrator who might be gay. And let's be honest, even the original Broadway production kind of did that.
A man who is in his apartment. He's a lonely man. He's had some tragedy in his life. He's sort of a low-functioning person.
When I was doing Drowsy, and the character that I played was basically a closeted homosexual man.
So I guess what all this video boils down to is a plea. A plea I am making to the theater community at large. Please take the Drowsy Chaperone seriously. There is a searing indictment of our volatile relationship to nostalgia buried within this very funny script. Did the writers intend that? It doesn't really matter. Do most productions uncover this interpretation? Typically not. But it is there. There is a universal story worth endorsing in this script that lies beneath the surface. And as a dynamic work of art, the question of what Drowsy is truly about won't be answered by one production. In fact, it may never be definitively answered, as every production interprets it a different way. While the show will almost certainly continue to be performed in the near future, it is my hope that a greater understanding of the unassuming complexity of the Drowsy Chaperone will keep it in the musical theater canon for a long, long while. If Harold Hill can do it, Man in Chair can too. Good night, everybody.
Rise up, Hamlet, perk up and sing a new refrain. Your incessant monologizing fills the castle with ennui. Your antic disposition is embarrassing to see. And by the way, your sulky brat, the answer is to be. You're driving poor Ophelia insane. So shut up, you rogue and peasant. Grow up, it's most unpleasant. Cheer up your melancholy day.